A spreadsheet author can use XLRT to build a standalone application. Let's run this quote application to see what the user experience looks like, and then we'll step back and look at XLRT Builder and Quick License that we use to construct it. So we're going to launch the application icon, and we see that it opens up an open data file window. It's like a built-in file manager built into the application. We can add new projects by clicking New and entering the name of a new project. We have a settings button that can be used to enter some general information that's then available to all these different workbook files. If we click on the settings button, it opens up a dialog and we can enter some common information. And later we'll see how that information is used within the workbook. The nice thing about using the settings dialog, you enter the information one time and it's available to all workbooks. Later, if one of these fields of data changes, you change it one time and all the workbooks are up to date. So we're going to go ahead and open up one of our workbook files, and when it opens up into a application window that consists of 3 sheets. The project sheet is where the user that's putting together a quote can enter some information about the customer, a project, give it a quote number and a date. On the details sheet, individual items can be quoted here. Let's look at one example. So we're going to give it a quantity of 5 and let's give it a price. And you can see as we're entering the information is calculating the subtotal and total. We have an import function that can import a CSV file and fill in a list of items, quantities, and prices. And let's go ahead and do that now. When we do this, we see that it's automatically calculated the subtotals as well and our total down here at the bottom. As we're going through the process, if we need additional lines of information within our quote, we can click the Add button to add additional rows, or click the Remove button to remove some rows. If we remove this row here, that will remove this subtotal and recalculate the total here, which we see when we click the Remove button. We also have an Export button that basically exports all the information we've typed in, including the quantity, price, and subtotal, out to a CSV file on disk. Let's go ahead and click the Export button now, and we'll just see how we can create a file which we're going to call it export.csv off to disk. If we want to clear out the information, we can just click the Clear button. If we go to the Summary tab, you can see that it's kind of summarized the information that we've entered. We see our total here, our quote number, and all the ABC construction details that were added in that settings dialog, and also information about our specific project that we're quoting here. We have a feature in this application where we can change this icon. So let's click on the logo button and we'll go and navigate to a location where we have a different type of logo. So we'll select this logo here, and you can see it added it to our sheet. And now if we click the print button, we can print this sheet off to disk, and part of the print process, it will actually hide these 2 buttons so they don't appear on the printed page. Although we won't cover all the details, in the next few minutes we'll cover the major steps used to construct this application. We're going to use the XLRT Builder to build our main workbook file. Once we have that finished, we'll then output a protected encrypted condensed file called an ERT file, which we'll store in this source folder. We've also put a copy of a ticket file that was configured using the Quick License application that defines the license that we want to apply to our application. And finally, we have an icon file for Mac or Windows that we can use to build our finished application. These get built with the Add License Wrapping tool. The Add License tool has a record of information that constructs all the individual parts to build the application. We see a path to our main workbook file. We see a path to the ticket file that defines the license, the icon we want to apply, and the output folder where our application will be sent. And we have some options that we can set up during the build process. You'll recall it presents an open data file window with a bunch of buttons, and this is where we configure which buttons will be invisible. We've decided we want a settings button, and so we had to configure the type of information that would be collected in that dialog. And that is done in this dialog here, where we enter the fields and what type of information we want to collect, and we can preview it before we actually build our application. Once we have all the different options set up, we can click the build button, and that will produce the finished application in the output folder. Now we're going to open our workbook into XLRT Builder so we can see how it was constructed. When we open up the builder, it asks us for what project we want to open. And you see it looks about the same, except across the top we have our builder tools that we use to construct the different sheets of this workbook. We've hidden our column and row headers and our grid lines to make it look more like an application. Let's go ahead and show those now so we can get a better idea of how this application was constructed. So we're going to show our grid lines here, our column headers, and we're going to change the maximum size of our window so we can resize it a little bit larger. So let's resize this so we can see our full tool palette across the top here. So you can see we have a grid of cells. We've entered text into some of those cells and used the properties tool here to where we could change the color or the font or size or bolding of the text. We've added a background fill color to the colors to the cells that we wanted to make editable so the user can easily distinguish where they can enter data and which ones are just static cells. So to make cells static, we can open up this tool, and that's where we can select a range of cells and change the cell type to static or editable or whatever type of cell we want. You can see we've added a picture element here with these controls at the top where we've added a control and selected a picture, and that adds that picture to our workbook, and then we can move it around, position it as needed. We've added some buttons. Let's go to the details sheet here. You can see this is the area where the user can type in different items, quantities, and prices, and it does a bit of calculations. So for example, you can see the calculation here is B2 times C2, and it ends up with the result here. And there's the formula for that calculation. So we have formulas in all these cells here and a formula down here to compute the total. We have a much larger area for adding more and more rows to this sheet, but right now they're all hidden, and then we just make those available with these add and remove buttons. If we wanted to see that, we could open up the cell size and visibility dialog there, and we can go to our row visibility. Let's select from row all the way down to the last one and make them all visible. And now you can see the full size of the workbook. We'll scroll through it here. At the bottom again, we have our buttons, which run a bit of script, and just make those rows available to the user as needed as they're adding items to the sheet. Finally, on our summary panel, again, we have a little grid of cells with some text. Now, in this case, this region of text is going to be coming from that settings dialog in our open data file window that we looked at earlier. And it's done with a little bit of script that happens when the workbook launches. This area comes from information typed into the project sheet, And this is some of the this is the quote number in the total, and we'll put the calculated result right in this area. We also have a place where you can kind of customize that with your own personal logo, and we've done that by putting a picture control on the sheet, and we've added a little bit of code behind this button that basically allows the user to select and replace that with a different picture. You'll recall when we first launched our application, it presented an open data file window where we had a set of buttons we could create different named copies of the workbook. Let's see where these files were actually being stored on disk. On a Mac computer, if we go to our hard drive, the users folder, the shared folder, and inside that folder, we'll see a folder called quote, which is the name of our application. That folder contains the subfolders and all the individual files that are constructed with this application. You'll recall we used the settings button, brought up a dialog where we could enter some information. The information was actually stored in this file called settings.data. Now let's see how that file of information is actually brought into the workbook. Most of the dynamic aspects of this application are done with scripting commands. We have a window that we can bring up that shows all the scripting commands related to this application. These commands are typically initiated when the user clicks a button. For example, you click this logo button and it runs this bit of script right here. So here's the button name and equals in the script name, or the scripting commands. We also can trigger commands to be run based on an event, and that's how we handle the bringing in of this settings data. So we have an event called onOpen, and that event gets triggered whenever the workbook opens, and then there's an equal sign, and then there's a set of commands following. So a command looks like this, the name of the command and one or more parameters separated by commas, and then then we have a bar, and then we have the next command. Let's specifically look at this command, the settings load command. So whenever the workbook opens, it's going to run this command, and what this command does is it loads data from that settings file that we looked at a moment ago, and it just takes the name of one of the bits of data and it puts it into a particular cell. So we're going to take the company name and put it into the cell called summary B6, which is right here. And then we take the next piece of data, the address, and put it into B7, which is right here, and so on. So that's how this settings information is automatically maintained by the application. Whenever a user makes changes in that dialog, that settings dialog, and later opens any one of the workbooks, the onOpen event is triggered, it runs that command, and it pulls the data out of that file and sticks it in the cells of the workbook. Let's examine how this logo button works. First, if we look at the tool that was actually used to create this picture, it's a type of control, picture control. And if we examine the properties of this, we see the control is named the logo, and we have the position on the screen and the size and everything. If we look back at the script that runs when this logo button is clicked, and here's the line of script that runs, we can see that the first thing this script does is it runs the command plugin file from user prompt, where it basically prompts the user to select a picture file, and it stores that whatever picture file they selected in a file named picturelogo.jpg. in the plugins folder. The next command it runs is this replace picture from plugin command. And essentially all that does is it tells that we want to replace on the sheet called summary, the control called logo. We want to replace the picture with this company.logo JPEG file that we just stored in our plugins folder from that user prompt. And then finally we just redraw the screen, and that just redraws the screen with the new picture that the user has selected. Now let's examine how this print feature works. When the user clicks the print button, it's going to run a bit of script, and the goal is to print this sheet with these two buttons hidden and nicely formatted on 8.5 by 11 inch paper. So if we bring up our scripting window, we can see this is the line of script commands that gets run when the print button is clicked. The first command, form control visible, is making that print button invisible and also that logo button so it doesn't appear in our printed output. And we have to run this command, form control refresh, to essentially refresh the screen after hiding those two buttons. We see this command, sheet to JPEG, which basically takes the current sheet and creates a JPEG image from it. And then this command, JPEG for paper, which takes that image and then constructs a new image where that is centered on the sheet, giving it the appropriate paper size and margins that we want to place around the image. Once we've done all that, we finally do the print JPEG command, which essentially just prints that JPEG out to the printer. And then to wrap things up, we then make those two controls visible again on our sheet and redraw the screen. So that's how the print feature works. Let's examine how a couple of the buttons on the details sheet works. You'll recall that when the user clicks the Add button, it makes a new row visible for typing a new item. And if they click Remove, it hides the last row. The Import button brings data in from a file and populates this item list. And the nice thing about the XLRT Builder environment, you can actually be using these buttons as you're building up your application. So for example, if we click the Import button, it runs the script behind it and it's loaded in the data. And when we click the Clear button, it's going to clear out all this data. So let's go and examine how that Clear button works. If we bring up our scripting window, and we'll locate that Clear button, we can see that we simply have a var to cell range command that copies a variable named empty that was predefined to be just an empty string. So we copy the value of that variable into this range of cells, A2 to D100, and then recalculate the sheet and redraw it, and that's what clears out everything on this details sheet. Let's examine the export button. So when the user clicks the export button, it's going to run this bit of code. And it's going to do the export data to plugin command, which basically takes the data that's in this range and saves it out to a CSV file named export.csv with comma delimiters between the columns and carry return line feed delimiters between the rows of the data, and it's using double quotes around each value in that CSV file. This gets saved off to the plugins folder, so there's an associated plugin folder for your XLRT, and that's just a convenient place for storing files or bringing files in or putting other resources that are used by your application. So again, this export button is building this export.csv file, and then it's using this command file save as from plugin, where it pops up a dialog and allows the user to put that file copied to any location they want on disk so they can easily find it. To summarize, to build this quote application, we started with the XLRT builder and constructed our workbook. We then saved the workbook out to an encrypted ERT file in the source folder. We used Quick License Application to define the license we wanted to apply. We've got an icon that we can apply to it for building a Mac application, or a different icon for building a Windows application. And finally, we use the Add License Wrapping tool to wrap those files from the source folder into a finished application, which is stored in the output folder.